Picture this. It's the winter of 1834 in the Rocky Mountains. Not the kind of winter you and I might complain about when our car won't start or the heating bill comes due. No. This was the kind of winter that could kill you in minutes if you made one wrong move. The kind that turned grown men into desperate creatures, huddled around fires that seemed to give off about as much warmth as a birthday candle in a hurricane. The Sublette Campbell Fur Brigade, imagine a rough equivalent of a modern oil exploration team, except instead of searching for black gold, they were after beaver pelts worth their weight in actual gold, had already lost 12 men to frostbite in a single 3-day blizzard near the Snake River. 12 men. In 3 days. Let that sink in for a moment. Among those still breathing was young Thomas Brennan, just 19 years old, fresh from County Cork, with dreams of American fortune dancing in his head like so many young immigrants before and after him. But Thomas wasn't dreaming anymore. He was watching in absolute horror as the camp doctor, and I use that term loosely, since his main qualification was probably that he could hold a saw steady worked by flickering candlelight to remove his tent mate's blackened fingers. The screams echoed off the canyon walls like some unholy choir, bouncing back and forth until you couldn't tell if the sound was coming from the man on the makeshift operating table or from the mountains themselves. The traditional treatment, and this tells you everything you need to know about how desperate these men were, involved rubbing snow on frozen flesh. Snow. On frostbite. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, but these mountain men had learned it from other mountain men who had learned it from others, and sometimes tradition persists even when it's killing you. Of course, rubbing snow on frostbitten tissue did exactly what you'd expect. It hastened the tissue death. The cellular damage was already catastrophic, and adding more cold was like kicking a man when he's down. But they didn't know that. How could they? This was 1834, decades before germ theory, let alone understanding of blood circulation and tissue preservation. Into this frozen hell, and I mean that literally, because for these men, this was as close to hell as they could imagine, rode a figure that would become legend. His name was Jedediah Mackenzie, and the first thing anyone noticed about him wasn't his weathered face or his steady eyes, or even the way he sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. No, what they noticed were his hands. His hands were unmarked. Now, you have to understand what this meant. Every mountain man worth his salt had missing fingers. It was like a professional badge, proof that you'd survived winters that killed lesser men. Missing fingertips, missing whole fingers, sometimes missing entire hands, this was the price of admission to the Brotherhood of the Mountains. But Mackenzie? His hands were whole. The Shoshone had a name for him, Frostwalker. And when the Shoshone give you a name like that, it's not because you have a catchy marketing slogan. It's because you've done something that defies their understanding of the natural world. Whispers followed his arrival at the desperate camp like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Men who hadn't spoken above a grunt in weeks found themselves gathering in small groups, pointing, speculating. Brigade leader William Sublette, think of him as the expedition's CEO, responsible not just for the lives of his men, but for the massive financial investment behind the operation, was facing complete ruin. His workforce was depleting faster than he could replace them, and dead men don't trap beaver. He'd invested everything in this expedition, borrowed against future returns, made promises to investors back east who expected results, not excuses about winter casualties. So, when Mackenzie rode into camp, Sublette saw opportunity. He offered Mackenzie $200 in gold for his secret. $200 in 1834 was serious money, equivalent to maybe $20,000 today. It was enough to buy a small farm, set a man up for life if he was careful with it. But Mackenzie wasn't interested in a one-time payment. He countered with something that must have seemed audacious to Sublette, a 5% partnership stake in the entire operation. 5% of everything. Mackenzie knew the value of what he carried, and he wasn't about to sell it cheap. Around the campfire that night, as the temperature dropped and men pulled their blankets tighter, Mackenzie's backstory emerged piece by piece, like smoke through fabric. Born in the Scottish Highlands' already tough country that bred tough men, he'd somehow survived a shipwreck on Hudson Bay in winter. Just think about that for a moment. The water temperature alone should have killed him in minutes, but survive he did, And more than that, he'd lived 3 entire winters with the Cree people. 3 winters. Most white men who found themselves among native tribes in emergency situations considered themselves lucky to survive 3 weeks. But Mackenzie had done more than survive. He'd learned. An elder woman named Singing Crow had taught him what she called the old ways of survival. When Mackenzie finally revealed what his secret technique involved, the reaction from the hardened mountain men was immediate. This had to be some kind of joke. Buffalo blood, rendered fat, crushed juniper berries, and other secret ingredients that Mackenzie would only reveal to those who proved themselves worthy. It sounded like something a child might concoct playing in the mud, not a serious medical treatment. Buffalo blood. These men had butchered hundreds of buffalo, had been up to their elbows in the stuff, and somehow this Scottish stranger was telling them that the answer to their frozen fingers and toes had been right there in front of them all along. The mixture seemed not just absurd, but almost insulting to their intelligence. But here's the thing about desperate men. They'll try anything once. And looking at Mackenzie's intact hands, at the way he moved through the snow like it was a mild spring day, at the absolute confidence in his voice when he spoke about surviving the cold well, maybe there was something to this savage nonsense after all. The mountain men exchanged glances across the firelight, each wondering the same thing. Could this strange mixture really be the difference between keeping their extremities and losing them to the surgeon's saw? More importantly, could it be the difference between life and death in a land where winter showed no mercy to the unprepared? Mackenzie looked around the circle of weathered faces, reading the mixture of skepticism and desperate hope in their eyes. He knew what they were thinking because he'd thought it himself once, before Singing Crow had saved his life, with knowledge that seemed to defy everything he thought he understood about surviving in the cold. "Tomorrow," he said simply, his voice carrying easily through the mountain air, "I'll show you." And with those 3 words, everything was about to change for the fur brigades of the Rocky Mountains. Dawn broke crimson over the mountains that next morning, painting the snow the color of fresh blood which, as it turned out, was remarkably appropriate, foreshadowing. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, hitting what modern meteorologists would measure at 35 degrees below zero. That's the kind of cold where your breath doesn't just fog, it crystallizes and falls to the ground like tiny diamonds of ice. Mackenzie led the gathered trappers to a fresh buffalo kill. Now, buffalo hunting in winter wasn't like the romanticized scenes you might see in movies. This was brutal, desperate work. The animal had been brought down just hours before, and steam still rose from its massive carcass like some prehistoric dragon breathing its last. The smell hit them first, that metallic tang of fresh blood, mixed with the musky scent of the great beast's fur. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every man present for the rest of their lives. With practiced movements that spoke of countless repetitions, Mackenzie plunged his bare hands deep into the buffalo's steaming entrails. Not with gloves, not with tools, bare hands, right into the hot, sticky mass of organs and blood. The mountain men watched in fascination and revulsion as he began mixing the hot blood with carefully prepared fat that he'd been rendering over low fires for days, getting the consistency just right. He added crushed juniper berries, their sharp, almost gin-like scent cutting through the metallic smell of blood. Then came dried sage, crumbled between his fingers with the same care a chef might use preparing herbs for a fine meal. And finally, a mysterious powder from his medicine bag, something grey-green that none of them could identify, though the Shoshone observers nodded knowingly when they saw it. The smell that rose from this mixture was unlike anything they'd experienced. Metallic, herbal, wild, like the essence of the mountain wilderness itself, had been captured and concentrated into this strange brew. It was primal in a way that spoke to something deep in their bones, something that remembered when all humans had to know such things to survive. Young Thomas Brennan stepped forward first. Remember, this is the 19-year-old from County Cork whose toes were already showing the telltale white patches of early frostbite. In modern terms, he was looking at possible amputation within days, if something didn't change. He had everything to gain and, frankly, not much to lose. Mackenzie's application was both intensely practical and somehow ceremonial. He warmed the mixture to body temperature, not scalding, hot, not cold, but that perfect warmth that feels like life itself. Then he began coating every inch of Brennan's exposed skin, working the mixture deep into the tissue with movements that were part massage, part medical treatment, part ancient ritual. And as he worked, he spoke words in Cree soft, rhythmic words that seemed to match the rhythm of his hands. The other men couldn't understand the language, but they understood the tone. This wasn't magic or superstition. This was medicine, passed down through generations of people who had survived in conditions that would kill most human beings. Within minutes, not hours, not days, but minutes, Brennan felt something extraordinary happening. Heat began spreading through his feet, radiating up from his toes like warmth from a banked fire suddenly given fresh air. But this wasn't the false warmth of freezing, that dangerous sensation that fools people into thinking they're warm when they're actually dying. This was genuine circulation returning, blood flowing where it hadn't flowed properly in days. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Brennan whispered, his Irish accent thick with amazement. "I can feel me toes again." But not everyone was convinced. Big Jim Hartley, a veteran trapper who'd already lost 3 toes to previous winters, spat into the snow with disgust. Hartley was the kind of man who'd survived by trusting only what he could see and touch and understand. He'd built his reputation on practical knowledge, hard-won experience, and a healthy skepticism of anything that seemed too good to be true. "Savage nonsense," he declared loudly enough for the whole camp to hear. "Bunch of heathen mumbo-jumbo. You want to roll around in buffalo guts like some kind of wild animal. That's your business. But don't expect civilized men to—" Mackenzie held up a hand, cutting him off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and absolutely confident. "You want proof, Jim? Real proof that'll settle this once and for all." The challenge was issued quietly, but in the mountain silence, every word carried like a gunshot. Mackenzie proposed a wager that would either prove his technique beyond any doubt or kill him in the attempt. He would spend an entire night on Freezing Man's Peak, a 9,000-foot elevation that had earned its name by claiming the lives of at least 6 men over the years. 9,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains in winter. To put this in perspective, that's higher than most commercial airliners fly over populated areas. The air is thin, the wind is constant, and the cold is so intense it can freeze exposed skin in minutes. Men had died up there in summer. In winter, it was considered a death sentence. Mackenzie would go up wearing only basic clothes, no heavy furs, no multiple layers, just simple wool and leather that any trapper might wear on a mild day. His only protection would be the blood mixture applied to his exposed skin. But Mackenzie had one condition that showed he understood the bigger picture here. This wasn't just about proving a point or winning a bet. 5 men had to learn the full technique first, ensuring that the knowledge wouldn't die with him if something went wrong. This wasn't the action of a showman or a gambler. This was the action of a teacher, someone who understood that knowledge shared is knowledge preserved. The 5 volunteers stepped forward immediately. Brennan, of course, still marveling at the circulation in his feet. 3 other trappers whose fingers showed the early signs of frostbite. And surprisingly, one of the Shoshone guides, an older man named Running Wolf, who spoke enough English to follow the instructions and seemed to recognize elements of the technique from his own people's traditions. Mackenzie spent the rest of that day teaching them everything. Not just the mixture, though, that was crucial, but the philosophy behind it. "The buffalo must be thanked," he explained, not out of superstition but out of respect, for the life that was making their survival possible. The juniper had to be gathered with gratitude, each berry selected, with the understanding that it had grown through harsh seasons, to be available when needed most. The application itself required focus and intention. This wasn't just slapping on some mixture and hoping for the best. Every square inch of exposed skin had to be covered, worked deep into the tissue, reapplied every 4 hours without fail. The men who would survive the mountains were the men who took responsibility not just for themselves, but for checking their brothers' extremities every 2 hours, watching for the signs that meant life or death. As the sun set and the temperature began its inevitable plunge toward the depths of mountain winter, Mackenzie made his final preparations. He gathered enough of the mixture for the night, carefully packed in containers that would keep it from freezing solid. He checked his simple clothes one last time, said a few words to Morning Star, his crow wife, who had been helping refine the mixture with additional herbs that prevented infection, and began the climb toward Freezing Man's Peak. The watchers below saw his fire go out at midnight. In the absolute silence of the mountain night, even the distant snap of wood burning carries for miles. When that sound stopped, when the tiny orange glow disappeared from the peak above, every man in camp wondered if they'd just watched Mackenzie commit the most elaborate suicide in frontier history. The night stretched on forever. Men who should have been sleeping found themselves lying awake, staring up at the peak, wondering what they'd find come morning. Would they be climbing up to retrieve a frozen corpse? Would Mackenzie's strange technique prove to be nothing more than false hope wrapped in buffalo blood and prairie herbs? Dawn came eventually, as it always does, painting the peak in those same shades of crimson and gold. And there, calmly melting snow for his morning coffee, as if he'd spent the night in a comfortable cabin instead of on a peak that had killed better men than him, sat Jedediah Mackenzie. When the first rescue party reached him, they found something that defied every piece of conventional wisdom they'd learned about surviving in the cold. Mackenzie wasn't just alive, he was comfortable. His extremities were intact, his skin showed no signs of frostbite, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd just spent a pleasant evening outdoors. The mixture, reapplied every 4 hours through the night, exactly as he'd taught the others, had formed what modern science would later prove was an insulating layer that also increased blood flow to extremities. The buffalo fat created a barrier against heat loss, while the juniper's natural compounds actually dilated blood vessels, ensuring circulation continued even in extreme cold. But more than that, Mackenzie had demonstrated something that would change how men thought about surviving in the wilderness. The secret wasn't just about the right mixture or the right technique. It was about understanding that survival was a partnership between man and nature, between individual knowledge and community care, between ancient wisdom and practical application. As Mackenzie descended from Freezing Man's Peak that morning, alive and whole and grinning like a man who'd just pulled off the greatest magic trick in frontier history, every single person in that camp knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. The age of losing fingers and toes to winter was about to end. The revolution had begun. Word of Mackenzie's success spread through the mountain camps faster than spring melt rushing down the mountainsides. And I want you to understand what fast meant in 1835. We're not talking about Twitter or even telegraph lines. We're talking about men on horseback, traveling through some of the most dangerous terrain on the continent, carrying news that seemed too incredible to believe. Picture the scene. A lone rider approaches a distant camp, his horse steaming in the cold air, and before he's even dismounted, men are gathering around him. You hear about that Mackenzie fellow, the one they call Frost Walker? He's got something that stops the freeze from taking your fingers. And then the skeptical laughs, the shaking of heads, the inevitable questions that always follow when someone claims to have found the impossible. But here's the thing about the mountain men, they were practical people. They'd listen to the story, maybe laugh a bit, but then they'd look down at their own hands, count the fingers they'd already lost, and think about the friends they'd buried in shallow graves because the cold had claimed them. Suddenly, a story that seemed too good to be true started seeming like something worth investigating. By January of 1835, desperate brigades were actively seeking Mackenzie out, offering top dollar for training. And when I say top dollar, I mean the kind of money that could set a man up for life. We're talking about fur companies that had invested thousands of dollars in equipment and men, watching their investments literally freeze to death, finger by finger, toe by toe. Mackenzie, showing the kind of business acumen that would make modern entrepreneurs jealous, established a teaching system that was both practical and scalable. Groups of 8 men, small enough for personal attention, large enough to be efficient. 5 days of intensive instruction covering not just the mixing techniques, but something much more profound, the philosophy behind survival. This wasn't just about slapping some buffalo blood on your hands and calling it good. Mackenzie taught them that the buffalo must be thanked not out of some mystical belief, but out of recognition that survival in the wilderness required respect for the creatures that made your survival possible. The juniper had to be gathered with gratitude. each berry selected with the understanding that this plant had survived harsh seasons to be available when human lives depended on it. But the most revolutionary aspect wasn't the mixture itself, it was the community responsibility that came with it. Mackenzie insisted that the application be done with focus on keeping one's brothers whole. Every 2 hours, without fail, men had to check each other's extremities. Every 4 hours, the mixture had to be reapplied. This wasn't individual survival, this was collective survival, and that changed everything about how these men related to each other. Think about it. These were tough, independent men who prided themselves on self-reliance. Asking for help was seen as weakness. Admitting vulnerability was practically unthinkable, but Mackenzie's system required them to literally put their lives in each other's hands. It created bonds that went beyond professional cooperation. It created brotherhood. Now, success on this scale doesn't go unnoticed by the major players. The American Fur Company think of them as the Google or Amazon of the fur trade. With resources and reach that dwarfed smaller operations, sent a spy named Jacob Thornton to steal the formula. Corporate espionage, 1830s style. Thornton was good at his job. He'd successfully infiltrated competitor operations before, learned their trade secrets, reported back to his handlers with information that gave the American Fur Company decisive advantages. He approached Mackenzie's operation with the same calculated professionalism that had served him well in the past. But something unexpected happened. Thornton returned to the American Fur Company, not with stolen secrets, but completely converted to Mackenzie's approach. He spoke with the fervor of a man who'd experienced something that challenged everything he thought he knew about survival and human nature. Part of what converted Thornton was meeting Morning Star, Mackenzie's crow wife. Now, I want to be careful here about how we understand her role. This wasn't some mystical Native American healer stereotype. Morning Star was a practical woman with deep knowledge of plant medicine who had been working systematically to refine Mackenzie's mixture with additional herbs that prevented infection. See, frostbite wasn't just about freezing, it was about what happened afterward. Tissue damage, infection, gangrene. Morning Star had identified specific plants that could be added to the mixture to address these secondary complications. She was, in modern terms, conducting medical research, testing combinations, documenting results. The fact that she was doing this without formal education or laboratory equipment makes her contributions even more remarkable. The transformation went beyond just the physical aspects of preventing frostbite. Camps that adopted Mackenzie's technique reported something that the company accountants back east initially dismissed as impossible: stronger unity among the men. But it made perfect sense when you thought about it. When your survival depends on your colleagues checking your extremities every 2 hours, when their survival depends on you doing the same for them, you develop relationships that go far beyond normal workplace cooperation. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, one of the first to fully adopt Mackenzie's methods, reported a 70% reduction in losses to frostbite by February. 70%. In a single winter season. To put this in modern business terms, imagine if a tech company found a way to reduce employee turnover by 70% overnight. The productivity gains, the cost savings, the competitive advantage, it would be revolutionary. That's exactly what was happening in the fur trade. Trading posts throughout the Rockies began stocking the ingredients. Buffalo fat, which had previously been discarded or used for basic purposes, suddenly became a valuable commodity. Juniper berries, gathered by native tribes as part of traditional seasonal activities, saw their market value increase by 400%. Local economies that had been struggling found new sources of income, but perhaps the most significant moment came during the 1835 Great Rendezvous at Green River. The annual rendezvous was like a combination trade show, social event, and cultural exchange, bringing together fur trappers, traders, native tribes, and company representatives from across the Western Territories. Over 600 people gathered that year, the largest rendezvous in the event's history. Mackenzie used this gathering as his stage for the largest demonstration yet attempted. In a single week, he trained 40 instructors in his technique, 40 men who would carry this knowledge back to their own operations. creating a network that would spread across the entire Rocky Mountain region like roots from a massive tree. The training wasn't just technical, it was cultural. These 40 men became evangelists for a new approach to wilderness survival, one that emphasized community responsibility and respect for the natural world. They carried with them not just knowledge of mixing buffalo blood and juniper berries, but a philosophy that would influence how people thought about survival for generations. But success, especially rapid success, always creates resistance, and the resistance came from quarters that Mackenzie probably didn't expect. Camp doctors, whose authority and livelihood depended on treating frostbite injuries, saw their role being diminished. If men weren't losing fingers and toes, what did they need doctors for? Traditional trappers, men who had survived using the old methods and wore their missing digits as badges of honor, viewed the blood ritual as ungodly. They'd lost friends, lost parts of themselves, to the mountain winters. The idea that all of that suffering could have been prevented with some native knowledge and buffalo blood was almost insulting to their sacrifices. The tension came to a head when 3 men attacked Mackenzie's supply tent during the rendezvous. They intended to destroy his stores of prepared mixture and scatter his carefully gathered ingredients. What they hadn't counted on was how many people now saw Mackenzie's knowledge as literally vital to their survival. A coalition of native and white trappers drove off the attackers, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about a medical technique anymore. This was about different philosophies of survival, different approaches to community, different ways of understanding man's relationship with the natural world. The revolution in red had begun, and like all revolutions, it was creating both passionate supporters and determined enemies. The question was, which side would ultimately prevail in the harsh democracy of the wilderness, where the only vote that mattered was whether you lived or died through another mountain winter? Mackenzie looked out over the Green River gathering, watching his trained instructors prepare to spread across the mountains, carrying knowledge that could save hundreds of lives. He understood that he'd started something that was now bigger than any one person could control. The age of winter claiming men's fingers and toes was ending. But what would replace it? And at what cost? By 1836, something unprecedented had happened in the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Mackenzie's technique had become more than just a survival method. It had become mountain law, not the kind of law written in books by distant legislators, but the kind that emerges when human beings discover something that literally means the difference between life and death. The American Fur Company, that corporate giant we talked about earlier, made the technique official company policy. Think about that for a moment. A major corporation adopting what had started as Native American, traditional knowledge, filtered through a Scottish immigrant's experience, and proven by desperate mountain men. They published the first written manual, though Mackenzie insisted that the most crucial elements could only be learned through direct, hand-to-hand instruction. Blood camps were established at strategic points throughout the Rockies. These weren't just trading posts anymore, they were medical stations where buffalo were hunted specifically for the mixture. Native tribes received regular payment for gathering rights to juniper berries, creating the first systematic economic partnership between the fur companies and indigenous communities based on traditional ecological knowledge. The network of trained practitioners had evolved into something that would have made modern military leaders envious. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Blood, and they functioned as an informal medical corps that moved through the mountains, teaching, treating, and ensuring that no camp was left without someone who knew the technique. This brotherhood would later influence how military organizations thought about cold weather training. Elements of Mackenzie's approach, the buddy system for checking extremities, the community responsibility for collective survival, the integration of traditional knowledge with practical application, these concepts would eventually find their way into military doctrine for operations in extreme environments. But success on this scale inevitably brings complications that no one anticipates. Mackenzie began receiving death threats from people who had been profiting from selling questionable frostbite remedies. Before his technique, desperate men would try anything: patent medicines, folk cures, treatments that often did more harm than good. An entire cottage industry had grown up around winter medical emergencies, and Mackenzie's proven method was destroying that market. Legal challenges emerged, when entrepreneurs attempted to patent the technique. Picture this: men in suits sitting in courtrooms back east, trying to claim ownership of knowledge that had kept indigenous peoples alive for generations and had been freely shared by Mackenzie with anyone willing to learn. The judges, showing more wisdom than many of their contemporary decisions might suggest, ruled that traditional knowledge couldn't be owned by any individual or corporation. This legal precedent would prove important for future cases involving indigenous knowledge and intellectual property rights. Mackenzie had unknowingly helped establish the principle that survival knowledge belongs to humanity as a whole, not to whoever first writes it down in a form that courts recognize. The winter of 1836 brought Mackenzie to a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. In March of 1837, as the mountains began their slow transition from winter's grip towards spring, he told Morning Star that he needed to return something to the Cree people. He was deliberately vague about what that something was, but those close to him understood that he felt a debt to the people who had saved his life and shared their knowledge. He departed alone, carrying only basic supplies and a waterproof pouch that he guarded carefully. Morning Star later said that he spoke about needing to complete a circle, to return knowledge where it belonged, and to ensure that the source of the wisdom would be honored properly. Mackenzie never returned. Search parties scoured the mountains for months. The Brotherhood of the Blood organized the most systematic search effort the Rockies had ever seen, with teams checking every canyon, every peak, every possible route he might have taken. They found his horse, unharmed, grazing in a meadow near the Continental Divide. They found his camping gear, neatly arranged as if he'd simply stepped away for a moment. But all they found of Mackenzie himself was his journal, wrapped in waterproof, beaver pelt, and placed carefully on a rock outcropping where it would be easily visible to searchers. The journal contained detailed instructions for the technique, refinements that Morning Star had developed, and notes about applications they hadn't yet tried. But the final entry was what people remembered. This knowledge belongs to all who brave the cold. That's when the legends began. Trappers started reporting sightings of a figure moving through blizzards with impossible speed and grace. Always at a distance, always in conditions where normal human survival would be questionable. The figure would appear near lost travelers, sometimes leaving behind prepared mixture or directions to safety, then vanish into the storm. The Shoshone and Crow peoples had their own stories. They spoke of Frostwalker returning to the spirit world but continuing to watch over those who honored the old ways. Whether you believed in spirits or not, the practical result was the same. People lost in winter storms survived at rates that defied explanation. The technique itself continued to evolve and spread far beyond the fur trade. Military expeditions to the Arctic adopted it for their operations. Railroad workers building through mountain passes swore by it, passing the knowledge from crew to crew as they pushed iron rails through territories that had previously been accessible only to the most skilled mountain men. Indigenous communities recognized elements of their own ancestral knowledge in Mackenzie's system, but also saw how he had adapted and refined it for different circumstances. The cross-cultural exchange of survival knowledge became a model for how traditional wisdom could be preserved and applied in changing times. Modern scientific analysis of Mackenzie's mixture reveals the genius behind what must have seemed like primitive folk medicine to skeptical observers. The blood's iron content helped prevent the cellular damage that leads to frostbite. The fat created an insulating barrier that reduced heat loss from exposed skin. The juniper berries contained compounds that naturally dilated blood vessels, maintaining circulation to extremities even in extreme cold. But perhaps most importantly, the ritual aspects, the regular checking, the community responsibility, the respectful approach to gathering ingredients created psychological and social frameworks that were just as crucial as the physical protection. Mackenzie had understood intuitively what modern psychology would later prove, that survival in extreme conditions depends as much on mental state and social support as on physical preparation. Today, wilderness survival schools still teach variations of Mackenzie's method. Military cold-weather training incorporates principles he established, and every winter, somewhere in the mountains, someone lost in a blizzard survives, using knowledge that can be traced back to a Scottish Cree mountain man who understood that the deadliest cold could only be defeated by the warmth of human connection. The brotherhood he created outlasted him by decades, evolving into informal networks of outdoor professionals who maintain the tradition of sharing survival knowledge freely. Park rangers, mountaineers, wilderness guides, they carry forward the understanding that certain knowledge is too important to be hoarded or sold. Mackenzie's greatest legacy wasn't the technique itself, remarkable as it was. His legacy was proving that survival wisdom transcends cultural boundaries, that traditional knowledge can be adapted and improved through respectful collaboration, and that the strongest defense against nature's extremes is human beings taking responsibility for each other's welfare. The mountains keep their secrets, and we'll never know exactly what happened to Jedediah Mackenzie in those final days. But every winter, when the storms sweep down from the peaks and the cold threatens to claim another victim, his true monument reveals itself. People helping people survive, knowledge shared freely, and the understanding that we are all stronger when we face the cold together. In the end, perhaps that's exactly what he would have wanted, not to be remembered as an individual hero, but as the man who proved that the warmest thing in the coldest places is the human capacity to care for one another.